Hello, all. I have a few things to talk about this week regarding the Cold War and some of the changes that produces in American politics. The Cold War follows on the victory in World War II. World War II is, of course, a global conflict that brings the United States in after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And then Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. This means that the United States fought both Germany and Japan, and played a major role in defeating both. Really, defeating Japan, not all by itself, but pretty close to being, solely responsible for the defeat of Japan. And then, in cooperation with the Soviet Union and Great Britain, defeating Nazi Germany. We oughtn't forget how many lives the Soviets lost in the defeat of Nazi Germany, and that they sacrificed quite a lot to do so, and took huge amounts of their own territory back from the Nazis, and also drove the Nazis out of Eastern Europe. Um, so that was how World War II ended. And then the question is, what kind of world is going to follow World War II? Well, one thing that we see is that the United States and the Soviet Union are the two greatest powers after World War II is over. Britain, France, Germany, all are badly damaged. Germany is totally defeated, divided among the victorious powers. Um, but even the ability of Britain and France to hold on to their colonial empires around the world, in the continent of Africa, in Asia, these are, it's really hard for them to hold on, and their colonies are going to start becoming independent pretty soon after the war ends in 1945. And the decline of Britain, France, and Germany as great world powers leaves an opening for the next great powers. And so those two replacements are the United States and the Soviet Union. Often they are called superpowers, because of their global reach, and their ability to influence world events. Now, the United States and the Soviet Union are very different types of countries. We can oversimplify, but the fact that the United States is a constitutional republic with basically democratic elections, um, and the fact that it's got a capitalist economic system, even though it's a pretty well-regulated capitalist economic system by the New Deal reforms. It's very different from the Soviet Union, which is governed by a dictator, Joseph Stalin, who has been trying to remake the old Russia into his image. Um, Tremendous amount of control by the government, sham elections where there's no real choice. Um, so these are different types of governments, and their goals are different too. The United States would like to see a more kind of capitalist world economy, again, well regulated by governments, but still free trade, the ability of the United States to trade on the world stage, not too many tariffs that would make it harder to trade. On the other hand, Stalin in the Soviet Union wants to have a world that's secure for the Soviet Union. He just suffered a horrible assault by the Nazi forces in World War II. Maybe losing 15, 20, 25 million people. And so Stalin wants to use Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Eastern Germany as a giant buffer zone that his country, the Soviet Union, will control, and be able to use them as allies and as a shield for future invasions, against future invasions. Okay, which he's convinced are coming. He's rather paranoid, but you can maybe understand some of that fear that he had, because Soviet Union or Russia had been invaded before, over the past 150 or so years. So Stalin wants a world safe for communism. The United States wants a world safe for capitalism, in a sense, to oversimplify a bit. But they're not really going to be able to come to conclusion about how that should be done. And so the great rivalry after World War II is the United States versus the Soviet Union. It's not an open war, though. They don't go to war against each other ever. Instead, we talk about this as the Cold War because there's chilly, cold relations between the two of them. Okay, but they never go to war. Instead, you kind of see this global chess match between the two of them for influence to try to increase the influence of their own countries, decrease the influence of the other country. And, well, it's a more open chessboard than ever before because, as I mentioned before, the colonies of European powers are going to be becoming more independent. Okay, so India, many different African countries like Congo and Kenya and many others, even China, what kind of the future of China is coming out from its domination by foreign countries before World War II in a lot of ways. So what kind of world are we going to have? And there's a lot of intrigue and support for different rebel groups or governments by the Soviet Union and the United States to promote allies of the superpower, most famously in Vietnam, where the United States supports the anti-communist forces. The Soviets support the communist forces. There's even a division between North and South Vietnam. The United States supports anti-communist South Vietnam. The Soviet Union and China, once China becomes communist, support the communist North. And then there's the struggle over what kind of Vietnam is going to emerge from that. So these are the kinds of big picture issues that the United States, which is now a great world power after World War II, the United States leaders have to decide, what's actually going to they're going to do, what they're going to do to advance United States interests. And really, it has to be a question about what are United States interests. Is it good for the United States to be involved all over the place trying to check the spread of communism? A lot of Americans at this time would have said yes. It's important to stand up to what they viewed as an awful system. And, communism was in many ways awful. Regardless of what you think of the ideas, the actual communist systems that we see in the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire, it's a good word for it, in Eastern Europe, communist China, communist North Vietnam, millions were killed, millions were imprisoned, millions were had their lives disrupted. So there was a serious evil in the eyes of many Americans to oppose. So what effects does that actually have on American government? Okay, well, on the one hand, the United States is determined, or U.S. leaders, the ones in power determined that the United States is going to maintain itself on the world stage. People like Harry Truman, a lot of the Republicans, in a sense, only disagree with how aggressive they should be, not so much whether they should be assertive out in the world. You have the development of what's sometimes called the national security state, the development of the CIA from a previous organization in World War II. So the Central Intelligence Agency that's going to be very active around the world, trying to gather intelligence for the United States to act, the National Security Administration, the National Security Council, trying to decide what must be done for the United States to be secure and what policies it must pursue around the world. The development of nuclear weapons took place in World War II, but then the big expansion of nuclear arsenals, okay, so that the United States and the Soviet Union and eventually other countries could destroy the world many times over if they ever used all their weapons. So those stakes are pretty high. And there's that idea again of the chess match between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, never fighting each other, but sometimes supporting rebel groups and governments that are fighting allies of the Soviet Union, the United States. Okay, so that's a major trend here. Now, that also means that there's in the United States an effort sometimes to efforts to try to get communist influence out, especially in the late 1940s, excuse me, and the early 1950s, coming to most famous in the McCarthy era, McCarthyism. But even before that, loyalty oaths and trying to drive communist sympathizers out of the government. Um, and they weren't. It wasn't all made up. There were communist sympathizers that were part of the government. By the time that McCarthy was so worried about it, it does not seem to have been an actual reality or in the kind of significance that he said. But there was big concerns about communist infiltration of American government, American intelligence agencies, things like that. That's a big example. Now, what about domestic politics? How does the Cold War affect that? As I mentioned last time, the fact that the United States fought Nazi Germany in World War II. Nazi Germany's most obvious characteristic was its virulent kind of German supremacy, hatred of Jews and many non-German peoples. Well, the United States was fighting a racist power, right? And yet at the same time, there was official racism in a lot of American society, most obviously in the Jim Crow system in the American South. And so the World War II and then the Cold War, where the United States was standing up for freedom, democracy, was the idea here, against tyranny and oppression. Well, again, it's not the same kind of tyranny and oppression that you'd see in, say, Stalin's Soviet Union going on in the American South, but it's very bad. It's denying people their constitutional rights. It's treating Black people as second-class citizens. And so the fact that the United States was standing up for freedom and democracy around the world meant that there were some who said, well, we've got to do it here too. That gave the civil rights movement some extra heft. And so did also the independence of, say, African countries in the post-World War II period. Okay. And so that's going to really affect American politics as it gives the civil rights advocates an extra kind of tool to use. When the demonstrations and violence against civil rights workers starts to go on TV, that's embarrassing for the United States. Okay. And it also leads to, again, as I mentioned before, but just to highlight it, a great debate about the American role in the world. One of the most divisive issues, along with civil rights and racial equality, things like that, in the 1960s is the Vietnam War. Why is the United States in Vietnam? To support an anti-communist government in South Vietnam against communist rebels who are supported by North Vietnam, okay, who are trying to take over South Vietnam and unite it with North Vietnam, okay? And the question becomes, is that the way to go? Do we stand up to communism in that way? Do we have any business in Vietnam? Or is the United States using an unjust level of violence there or getting involved in something that's not its business? Is American power good for the world, you could argue? And these kind of issues, as we'll talk about, become very important in our current political divisions about what the government's role is to promote equality or to promote American values around the world or to regulate the economy. On the other hand, is the government getting too big? Is it doing too much? Is it the war on poverty working or not? Is government welfare programs, government actions actually making things worse here in the United States? And these kind of issues are very important in the 1960s and afterwards, even to today.